Jamaica is talking about a leader who isn't even from the Caribbean, and no one saw this coming. Across Kingston, Spanish Town, and Montego Bay, one name has been rising in conversations, podcasts, and late-night barbershop debates. It's not a Jamaican politician. It's not a regional figure. It's a young military leader from West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. And the question isn't why he's trending online. The real question is why so many Jamaicans, from university students to taxi drivers to the diaspora abroad, are suddenly looking to him as a symbol of strength, clarity, and what leadership should feel like. Some call it inspiration. Some call it projection. Others think it's a warning light about Jamaica's own political frustration. But behind the hype, the memes, and the emotional reactions lies something deeper. A mirror reflecting what Jamaica wants, what Jamaica fears, and what Jamaica has not yet found at home. Today we dive straight into that mirror. When Jamaicans first started mentioning Ibrahim Traoré, it didn't feel like a political trend. It felt like a spark, something unexpected, something that didn't fit neatly into the usual Caribbean headlines. So the natural question is this: why did a young leader from a landlocked West African nation suddenly land on Jamaica's radar? Part of the answer begins with timing. Traoré rose to power at just around his mid-30s, becoming one of the youngest heads of state in the world. He stepped in during a moment of deep instability in Burkina Faso, promising security, sovereignty, and a clean break from decades of dependency. He expelled foreign troops. He pushed back against Francafrique. He joined forces with Mali and Niger to form the Sahel Alliance, a group centered on self-reliance rather than Western oversight. And every time he spoke, he projected a clarity that cut through global noise, a message of dignity, production, and national pride. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, a different kind of storm had been building. People were growing tired of rising crime, widening inequality, and political promises that felt recycled rather than transformational. Many Jamaicans were searching for a leader who spoke directly, firmly, and without apology. So when clips of Traoré began circulating online, speeches about sovereignty, about standing up to powerful nations, about reshaping an entire development model, they hit a nerve. Not because Jamaicans know Burkina Faso's internal politics in detail, but because the tone resonated with something deeper, a longing for courage, conviction, and decisive leadership at home. In other words, Traoré didn't enter Jamaica's conversation by accident. He entered because the emotional landscape was already prepared for a figure who embodied strength at a time when people felt vulnerable. And that is why his image became more than a headline. It became a reference point, a symbol, a benchmark for what many Jamaicans wish they were hearing in their own political spaces. Let's turn now to the mainstream media in Jamaica, the press that sets the tone for national conversation, that monitors, questions, and sometimes celebrates. In its coverage of Ibrahim Traoré, the Jamaica Gleaner took a particularly striking approach. The paper described him as part of a lineage of black leaders whose voices forced the status quo to listen. Marcus Garvey, Steve Biko, Thomas Sankara. These names were invoked not casually, but to signal that Traoré was being framed in more than geographical terms. The Gleaner suggested Traoré's real power lay in his refusal to remain silent. He didn't just lead a country, he led a narrative about sovereignty, about rejecting dependency, and about remaking a broken system. Yet the Gleaner was careful to highlight the unresolved risk behind the symbolism. Military takeover, questions about press freedom, the absence of established democratic traditions. These issues were raised in full light. The paper asked, can this model sustain itself? Is the enthusiasm truly grounded in measurable reform, or is it still a hopeful projection? This balanced tone, admiration mixed with caution, echoes what we are witnessing across Jamaica's public discourse. It tells us that while many Jamaicans are eager to embrace the idea of leadership that stands its ground, they are equally wary of repeating old patterns in new guise. In short, the mainstream Jamaican press views Traoré with both intrigue and reservation, demonstrating that support here is not blind, but deeply contextual. And that nuanced position is essential to understanding authentic Jamaican public opinion today. When we shift from the newsroom to the lecture hall, the tone around Ibrahim Traoré changes once again. Here, among Caribbean academics and commentators, Traoré isn't just a headline or a viral clip. He becomes a case study, a model, a conversation starter about what leadership could look like in post-colonial societies that are still navigating the long shadows of empire. Several Caribbean thinkers argue that the region has spent decades following development templates shaped by outside powers. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, then more recently, China. Yet despite all these shifts, true economic independence remains elusive. That's where Traoré enters their analysis. Not as a perfect example, but as a provocative one. He openly rejects heavy dependence on the IMF and World Bank. He speaks about building domestic capacity instead of relying on foreign loans. He cuts unnecessary government perks and calls for redirecting resources toward agriculture, production, and technology. To Caribbean intellectuals, these ideas aren't radical. They're overdue. They echo long-standing critiques about the region's vulnerability to global financial pressures and structural adjustment policies. But these scholars also bring a necessary level of skepticism. They warn that much of Traoré's global support is fueled by symbolism more than verified results. Some of these success stories circulating online, dramatic boosts in GDP, sweeping economic transformations, have come from social media pages, not official economic reports. So their admiration is not blind. It's measured, inspired by the narrative Traoré represents, yet cautious about the gap between rhetoric and reality. For many Caribbean thinkers, Traoré symbolizes a larger question. What would true sovereignty look like if a nation, any nation, finally decided to rewrite the rules instead of inheriting them? And that question is as relevant to Jamaica as it is to Burkina Faso. When the discussion moves from classrooms to call-in radio shows, the energy changes immediately. Caribbean political radio is where everyday concerns meet national reflection, where listeners debate leadership, accountability, and the future of the region. So it was only a matter of time before Ibrahim Traoré entered this space, not as a distant African figure, but as a point of comparison for Caribbean politics. On programs like Caribbean Exchange, hosts and guests began asking why a leader from Burkina Faso was capturing the imagination of Jamaican and Trinidadian listeners. Their conclusion came down to three themes. First, Traoré communicates with a sharpness that cuts through the polite, measured language people have grown accustomed to. His speeches are firm, unfiltered, and unapologetic, the exact opposite of what many Caribbean citizens hear from their own leaders, who often prioritize diplomacy over urgency. Second, his open challenge to Western influence resonates deeply across the post-colonial Caribbean. The idea of standing up to powerful nations, especially in economic negotiations, taps into a historical frustration that has never fully faded. It reminds people of earlier Caribbean movements rooted in dignity, sovereignty, and resistance. Third, Traoré's age matters. He is young. He represents a new generation of leadership, and for many Caribbean citizens, especially younger audiences, that is both refreshing and symbolic. But political radio doesn't deal in fantasy. It deals in warnings as much as inspiration. Hosts and callers raise real concerns. Can a military leader uphold democratic norms? Can strong rhetoric translate into stable long-term policy? And is the Caribbean idealizing Traoré, projecting onto him what it wishes it had at home? These questions show that admiration in Jamaica is not universal or unconditional. It is thoughtful, it is skeptical, and it reflects a society trying to understand not just who Traoré is, but what his rise says about Jamaica's own unmet expectations. With that tension building, we move to the emotional turning point, the hook, where the Jamaican conversation becomes something much more personal. Here's where the conversation takes an unexpected turn. Because when you strip away the speeches, the symbolism, and the international headlines, a deeper truth appears. The fascination with Ibrahim Traoré might not be about him at all. It might be about Jamaica. It might be about a population searching for the kind of leadership, certainty, and direction they no longer feel at home. And that raises a powerful question. What happens if someone with Traoré's tone, his youth, and his defiance suddenly emerged in Jamaican politics? Would the country cheer? Would it panic? Or would it finally confront the gap between what people want and what the system actually provides. This is the moment when the Caribbean reaction to Ibrahim Traoré stops being a political observation and becomes a mirror held up to Jamaica itself. And once that mirror appears, the unfiltered voices begin to pour out. When we step into the world of Jamaican YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook groups, the tone shifts instantly. Gone are the cautious analyses and academic reflections. Here, the reactions are raw, emotional, and unfiltered, the closest expression of what people genuinely feel. One viral Jamaican clip features a man staring straight into the camera saying, "If you touch Traoré, you touch all of us." It's not a policy argument. It's not geopolitical commentary. It's a protective instinct, the kind of emotional loyalty usually reserved for cultural heroes, not foreign heads of state. Another creator compares Traoré's speeches to those of Jamaican politicians. He plays a clip of Traoré speaking firmly about sovereignty, then switches to a Jamaican leader delivering a cautious, scripted statement. The content creator pauses, shakes his head, and simply says, "Feel the difference." These side-by-side comparisons struck a nerve with young Jamaicans. They see Traoré as fearless, direct, and connected to the struggles of ordinary people. A leader who speaks about corruption without hesitation. A leader who talks about producing food instead of importing it. A leader who frames development not as dependency, but as dignity. And beyond the ideas, the aesthetics matter too. The beret, the military uniform, the steady gaze, the background filled with flags, soldiers, or crowds. This style resonates deeply in a culture shaped by reggae defiance, dancehall bravado, Rastafari pride, and Garveyite identity. To many Jamaicans scrolling through their phones late at night, Traoré doesn't feel foreign. He feels familiar, as if he could walk into a Jamaican community meeting and fit right into the rhythm of the room. There are countless comments under these videos. Jamaica needs a man like this. He talks truth. He's not afraid like our leaders. These are not policy opinions. They are expressions of frustration, longing, and imagination. For a younger generation that has grown up hearing promises but not seeing transformation, Traoré becomes a symbol of what leadership could look like if someone finally decided to break the mold. And that's why Jamaican street voices matter so much in this story. They reveal the emotional heartbeat behind the phenomenon. A population searching for strength, clarity, and purpose, and projecting those desires onto a leader thousands of miles away. But emotion is only one side of the story. Next, we turn to Jamaicans who actually live in Burkina Faso. People who can tell us what life under Traoré truly feels like, far beyond the glow of social media. When we shift the lens from social media to real life, the picture becomes even more interesting. Because there is a small but growing number of Jamaicans who actually live in Burkina Faso, and their voices add a level of clarity that online reactions simply cannot provide. One of the most revealing perspectives comes from the Jamaicans to the World series, where a Jamaican woman shared her everyday experiences living in Ouagadougou. Her tone was calm, grounded, and remarkably balanced. She spoke about how welcoming the people are, describing a society that values community and connection in ways that felt familiar to her Caribbean upbringing. She talked about walking through local markets, interacting with neighbors, and noticing how many citizens openly express pride in their country's new direction. But she also explained something that many Jamaicans online don't fully see. Life in Burkina Faso under Traoré is not defined by dramatic speeches or viral clips. It is defined by routine, schools, markets, work, family, and a sense that people feel more ownership over their future than they did before. She mentioned that while the Western news often focuses heavily on instability, what she experiences daily is a quieter reality, resilience mixed with cautious optimism. In her words, the country feels like it is trying to stand upright after years of being bent under pressure. She didn't glorify Traoré. She didn't discredit him either. Instead, she offered something rare in the global conversation, a lived experience that sits between hype and fear, between admiration and skepticism. For Jamaicans watching from afar, these diaspora voices carry weight, because they remind us that leadership is not just a symbol or a speech, it is something people feel in their daily lives. And hearing from someone who wakes up in Burkina Faso every morning gives the conversation a grounding that social media alone cannot provide. But as we explore these perspectives, there remains one more group whose voices must be heard. Not the fans, not the romantics, but the skeptics who fear that history may be repeating itself. Not everyone in Jamaica is swept up by the excitement. For many older Jamaicans, and even some younger ones who follow African politics closely, the rise of Ibrahim Traoré triggers a familiar unease. They've seen this story before. A young, charismatic leader emerges. He speaks boldly about sovereignty, justice, and liberation. He challenges Western influence. He becomes a symbol of hope, especially among the global Black diaspora. And then, somewhere along the line, the promise collapses into instability, corruption, or authoritarian rule. So when Jamaican skeptics watch the growing admiration for Traoré, their first reaction is not celebration, it's caution. Some point out that Traoré came to power through a military takeover, a reminder that revolutionary beginnings often bypass democratic processes. Others question the lack of independent data about Burkina Faso's economic progress, noting that much of what circulates online comes from unofficial sources or political fan pages. They worry that Jamaicans, hungry for strong leadership, may be idealizing a figure they don't fully understand. They mention past African icons who were celebrated globally before reality caught up with them. Leaders who inspired millions until their administrations faced coups, sanctions, or internal repression. For this group of Jamaicans, the concern is not about Traoré alone. It is about the emotional cycle that follows charismatic leadership. The rise, the hope, the disappointment, and the fallout. They ask tough questions. Can a military-led government guarantee long-term stability? Can anti-Western rhetoric coexist with sustainable development? Can one leader reshape an entire system without slipping into the very traps he seeks to escape? These skeptics aren't rejecting Traoré. They're reminding Jamaicans that symbols can be powerful, but they can also be dangerous when they overshadow facts. Their message is steady and simple. Admire the ideas. Respect the courage. But keep your eyes open, because history has shown that charisma can ignite movements, but institutions are what sustain nations. And in the Caribbean, where memories of political turbulence still linger, this skepticism is not negativity. It is self-protection. With that caution in mind, we now turn to the final layer of this story, separating what is real from what is rumor and what is genuine admiration from what is digital fantasy. In the middle of all this admiration, caution, and debate, something else has been spreading just as quickly: misinformation. As Traoré's popularity grew in Jamaica, so did a wave of posts, headlines, and videos that looked real at first glance, but fell apart under scrutiny. Some claimed the Jamaican Prime Minister had issued an apology to Traoré. Others circulated edited graphics suggesting Jamaica was preparing a massive reconciliation fund for Burkina Faso. A few even announced fake state visits, complete with invented dates and official-looking seals. None of these stories came from Jamaican ministries, credible news outlets, or verified African sources. They were fabrications, sometimes created for clout, sometimes for humor, and sometimes simply because people wanted the story to be true. This is where the line between fact, hype, and fake becomes blurry. The fact is that Traoré has earned genuine admiration from many Jamaicans who see strength and clarity in his leadership style. The hype is that social media amplifies his image far beyond what we can reliably measure, turning short speeches into myth and symbolic gestures into proof of transformation. And the fake emerges in the gaps between emotion and evidence, filling the silence with stories crafted to satisfy expectation rather than truth. Why does this matter? Because once a narrative becomes bigger than the facts, it can shape public opinion in ways that drift far from reality. And in Jamaica, a country already balancing hope and frustration, clarity is more important than ever. Before we conclude, we must remember that understanding Traoré is not just about separating truth from fiction. It's about recognizing why people want certain stories to be true in the first place. So in the end, what do Jamaican views on Ibrahim Traoré really reveal? They reveal that Jamaica is drawn to boldness, to leaders who speak with conviction, who challenge powerful systems, and who dare to imagine a different future. They reveal that Jamaica is searching for dignity, sovereignty, and direction at a time when frustration runs deep and trust runs thin. They reveal that admiration for Traoré is not only about Burkina Faso, it is also about the hopes, disappointments, and unmet expectations within Jamaica itself. Some Jamaicans see inspiration, some see warning signs, some stand firmly in the middle, trying to balance emotion with reality. And together, these voices create a portrait far more complex than hype, fear, or hero worship. They create a window into the Jamaican political heartbeat, a mix of longing, caution, and quiet determination to envision something better. So the real question now is this: what does Jamaica truly want from its own leadership? And how will this conversation shape the future of Jamaica's political identity? Share your thoughts below, because the story of Traoré in Jamaica is not ending. It's only beginning.